Picture yourself walking into one of the grandest palaces the world has ever known. Golden corridors, sparkling chandeliers, and so much silk and satin it could circle the earth twice. But with a single deep breath, you'd be overwhelmed by a stench so vile it could make roses wither from across the room. Welcome to Versailles in the 17th century, a palace where splendor clashed with squalor, where refinement coexisted with rot, and where noblewomen, despite their crowns and jewels, faced a nightmare of hygiene. Today, we're plunging headfirst, thankfully only in spirit, into the shockingly unhygienic reality of royal women at the height of French power. These are the 5 worst hygiene practices of noblewomen, and trust me, you're not prepared. 1. Fear of bathing. If you were born into nobility in 17th century France, you were expected to embody elegance, charm, and impeccable style. Yet when it came to hygiene, the reality was far less refined. Bathing, the very act we now see as essential to cleanliness, was something most nobles avoided at all costs. At the time, medical science hadn't caught up with basic logic. Physicians warned that hot water was dangerous, claiming it opened the body's pores and left people vulnerable to deadly illnesses drifting in the air. On top of that, the church condemned bathing altogether, labeling bathhouses as sinful places of temptation and vanity. The result was a society that gradually abandoned water, turning cleanliness itself into a suspected risk. Women of the nobility didn't have access to private baths or the convenience of daily washing. In fact, a full bath was a rarity. Washing the entire body was often dismissed as unnecessary, dangerous, or even sinful. Instead, most aristocrats, including queens and princesses, relied on wiping their faces, hands, and sometimes their necks with cloths. But these weren't dampened with plain water. More often, they were soaked in alcohol, vinegar, or even saliva, which was thought to cleanse the skin without exposing it too much. And when the rare occasion for an actual bath arrived, it was almost always communal. Entire families would use the same tub, one after another. Naturally, the men bathed first. By the time women entered, the water was tepid, murky, and filled with remnants from everyone who came before, if there was any water left at all. The impact on the palace itself was undeniable. The odor stretched far beyond the stables. Visitors frequently remarked on the suffocating smell that lingered through the corridors of Versailles, a pungent blend of stale perfume, unwashed bodies, animal grease, and mold. It wasn't that the royals ignored appearances. On the contrary, they valued beauty greatly, but their idea of clean was very different from ours. For noblewomen who were expected to embody refinement and grace, the contradiction was harsh. Draped in fine silks, adorned with jewels, and powdered to perfection, they looked flawless from a distance. Yet beneath it all was skin that hadn't touched soap in months. It was the classic case of looking dazzling from afar, but unpleasant up close. 2. The absence of toilets. If avoiding baths wasn't dreadful enough, the next issue makes the reality of Versailles even more shocking. There were almost no toilets. The palace, a masterpiece of architecture filled with opulence and home to Europe's most powerful elites, had hundreds of rooms and entertained thousands of people. Yet when it came to bathrooms, nearly non-existent. Instead, the royal household depended on chamber pots, small bowls tucked under beds, hidden behind curtains, or stored in closets. When nature called, you used the pot, and then either you, or more often a servant, emptied it straight out the window. If the wind blew the wrong way or the courtyard below was crowded, unlucky bystanders might find themselves hit with more than they bargained for. And some courtiers didn't even bother with pots. Men were known to relieve themselves directly from balconies or wander into the gardens to do their business. Visitors and foreign dignitaries were horrified by what they saw. This wasn't an occasional mishap. It was widespread. Versailles became notorious for its suffocating odor, and its grand corridors often doubled as makeshift toilets. Picture a noblewoman gliding through the halls in her ornate gown, lifting her skirts not only to display the embroidery, but to avoid stepping in piles of human waste. Conditions grew so unbearable that in 1715, an official decree was issued. The palace corridors had to be cleaned once a week. Not every day, not after gatherings, just weekly. And at the time, that was celebrated as progress. As for wiping, the luxuries of toilet paper didn't exist. People made do with cloth rags, handfuls of straw, leaves, or in desperate situations, their bare hands. Proper washing afterward was rare. When your bathroom system was a window and your cleaning routine was questionable at best, it's no surprise that parasites and disease spread through the palace with ease. 3. Wigs crawling with lice. If Versailles was the epicenter of Europe's fashion craze, its most striking symbol was the towering wigs and elaborate hairstyles of noblewomen. These weren't simple hairdos, they were feats of engineering. Styles rose dramatically above the head, decorated with ribbons, pearls, tiny gardens, and even miniature ships. Yes, actual ships, carefully crafted replicas balanced on top of powdered curls, sailing proudly through a sea of hair. To create such enormous hairstyles, women padded their hair with wire frames, horsehair, and stuffing made from wool or cotton. Once the towering structure was built, they slathered it with pomade made from animal fat, most often beef tallow. This greasy mixture acted like glue, shaping and holding the elaborate style in place. But the same sticky fat that gave the hair its form also provided the perfect breeding ground for lice. Since women rarely washed their hair and almost never removed their wigs for cleaning, these ornate creations became warm, greasy nests crawling with pests. Lice infestations weren't just frequent, they were expected. These elaborate hairstyles often hosted entire colonies of the insects, thriving undisturbed in the layers of powdered curls. To cope, noblewomen used special tools, long-handled silver lice claws, designed to scratch their irritated scalps without disrupting the carefully built style. These ornate instruments became accessories in themselves, sometimes carried to dinners or social gatherings. A lady might sip her wine gracefully, then subtly reach up with her claw to relieve the endless itching, all without breaking her composed appearance. Even with the discomfort, skipping the elaborate fashion displays was unthinkable. In the rigid hierarchy of Versailles, appearance equaled influence. To be seen out of style or underdressed was to risk losing social standing. So even if a woman's scalp crawled with lice and her hair reeked of rancid fat, she had no choice but to endure. These towering wigs weren't only unsanitary and uncomfortable, they were hazardous. Some were so heavy they left women with chronic neck pain, while others even caught fire from the open flames of nearby candles. Yet all of this was accepted as the cost of maintaining status at court. Common women were spared such misery. Many simply shaved their heads to avoid lice entirely. But for noblewomen, their elaborate hair was their crown, even if it concealed a thriving colony of pests beneath the powder and jewels. 4. Banquets filled with parasites. Now let's shift to something that should have been a source of delight: food. Royal banquets at Versailles were the stuff of legend. Tables overflowed with meat pies, delicate pastries, roasted pheasants, and candied fruits. Yet beneath this display of abundance hid a far less appetizing truth, a grim reality that could turn even the strongest stomach. The palace kitchens were not spared from Versailles' sanitation problems. In fact, they often suffered the worst of it. The plumbing was so poor that raw sewage sometimes seeped directly into cooking areas. On at least one occasion, it's said that wastewater even reached Queen Marie Antoinette's private kitchen. The effect on food safety was disastrous. Without refrigeration, ventilation, or proper waste disposal, contamination was inevitable. Meat spoiled within hours, fruits and vegetables sat out for days, and vermin roamed unchecked. Yet the cooks had no choice but to keep serving these questionable dishes to the kingdom's elite. The result? Stomach troubles were everywhere. Diarrhea, vomiting, and infections were routine. But the most disturbing of all were the parasites. Intestinal worms, especially tapeworms, thrived thanks to undercooked meat and unsanitary kitchens. Even King Louis XIV wasn't immune. He reportedly expelled a 6-inch tapeworm, proof that not even the most powerful man in France could escape the consequences of poor hygiene. For women of the court, mealtimes were less about nourishment and more about performance. They were expected to eat with elegance, converse with charm, raise toasts, and entertain. Yet beneath the refined manners, many silently endured nausea, stomach cramps, or more serious illnesses, all hidden behind a polished smile to keep up appearances. 5. Public childbirth. At last, we reach what should have been the most private and vulnerable moment in a woman's life: childbirth. But for royal women in 17th century France, giving birth wasn't only excruciating, it was a spectacle. For queens and high-ranking noblewomen, labor was treated as a matter of state. The birthing chamber wasn't a place of comfort or privacy. Instead, it was crowded with courtiers, priests, physicians, and members of the nobility, all present not to help, but simply to witness. When Queen Marie-Thérèse went into labor, her delivery room was packed so tightly it looked more like a theater than a medical space. The reason behind this practice was simple. Royal births had to be witnessed to prevent any suspicion of fraud. There was constant fear that a stillborn child or a girl might be secretly replaced with a healthy male heir. To avoid scandal, the entire delivery had to unfold in plain view. This left the mother, already in unbearable pain and extreme emotional strain, forced to endure the presence of an audience during her most vulnerable moment. Privacy and dignity were non-existent. Only expectation remained. Marie Antoinette herself once fainted immediately after giving birth, overwhelmed by the stifling heat and the mass of people crammed into her chamber. She was far from alone. Countless royal women collapsed, wept, or faced dangerous complications, all while being treated like performers on a stage. And childbirth in that era was anything but safe. With little medical understanding and no antibiotics, survival was uncertain for both mother and child. Nearly 1 in 3 children died before reaching the age of 3. Mothers, too, faced terrifyingly high risks, most often from infections spread by unwashed hands and unsterilized instruments. So while the birth of a royal heir was celebrated across the nation, behind the scenes it was overshadowed by fear, pain, and danger. The psychological toll on these women, forced to give birth under pressure, scrutiny, and the constant threat of death, was immense. Well, and there you have it. 5 unsettling truths from the glittering halls of Versailles. Behind the jeweled crowns, perfume-soaked corridors, and shimmering gowns, royal women endured lives marked by discomfort, indignity, and dangers that would make us cringe today. They embodied elegance and refinement in public, but in private, they itched, suffered, and struggled in ways history rarely highlights. If you've always imagined royal life as endless banquets and ball gowns, think again. The reality was far messier and painfully human. Until next time, keep digging into the past, because history isn't just fascinating, It can also be downright filthy,